Where's the problem coming from? Well, this is the very long run. Right now, we have a big federal deficit, but the situation is going to get worse. The greater part of the reason why it is going to get worse is because of increases in the price of health care. We've got folks like me about to retire and go on to Medicare, so we're going to have more people to provide with Medicare benefits. But at the same time, the cost of providing health care per person on the Medicare program is growing very rapidly. So if you look where we are right now, the cost of the federal government providing health care is equal to about 5% of our GDP. You go out 75 years, and it's going to be more like 20% of our GDP, increasing by a factor of 4. Part of that is because we're going to have more retirees, but most of it is going to be because the cost of health care has increased. Now, I want to take this picture and I want to add something to it. This is the federal government spending not including interest costs. So what happens if we continue along this path and we go out into the future and we continue collecting taxes of about the same magnitude that we're collecting today, and the federal government is borrowing money, and let's assume that interest rates behave perfectly well. We're not assuming anything in terms of increases in interest rates beyond what you would expect in a normal economy. And suddenly that big wedge of health care costs that looked so big is overwhelmed by instead an even larger increase in the cost of servicing the federal debt. So we're looking at this going forward. This situation is not sustainable. It's not even really comprehensible. You can't imagine the federal government spending more than 8 of every $10 of the nation's GDP, and yet that's where we're heading if we do not make fundamental changes in our course. But long before you get to this point, the rest of the world is going to look at all that Treasury paper they own, and at the very least they're going to say, we don't want any more. We're not interested in buying any further. You'll recall a few charts ago that over the last 10 years, if we wanted to borrow $5, we were depending on foreign investors to give us 3. Take those 3 away. If foreign investors are frightened about the prospects of lending to the United States, it's going to cost a lot more to convince domestic investors to buy that last 3 to make up the 5 that we need. So that's the prospect that we're facing. And if we continue heading in the direction in which we're going, we can anticipate that we'll have higher interest rates, potentially more rapid inflation. The federal government is going to have to tax more to pay just the interest on the debt. That is going to crowd out a lot of the things that we want the federal government to do. Even people who want a smaller federal government are going to want roads, they're going to want bridges, they're going to want airport security, they're going to want national security. There are a lot of things the federal government is doing that in the long run we all depend upon. So the federal government is going to be unable to do what it needs to do. Higher taxes are going to crowd out the capital that we need for private businesses to invest and grow, which is going to be reflected in those higher interest rates. And right now we are just continuing to walk down that road in that direction, and we need to shake up the system and get Washington to care about this problem and begin to act to solve it. So, what am I going to ask you to do? For those of you from the business community out here, what we would like you to do is to consider endorsing a statement that CED is putting forward from the U.S. business community, a public statement that says essentially 3 things. It says we members of the U.S. business community know 3 things. Number 1, we know that if the Congress gets its act together and solves this budget problem, the solution that occurs will not be exactly the solution that I personally would want to achieve. Now, why is that true? The budget deficit is a big, complicated problem. The federal budget is a big and complicated structure. Anything that extends all the way from making sure that spinach is safe to making sure that the entire United States of America is safe is going to be a big institution. trying to solve the federal budget problem is a little bit like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle, where the 1,000 pieces are identical 1-inch squares, all of which are colored white. Or take that back, they're probably colored gray, because this is a very gray situation. If you gave every person in this room that 1,000-piece puzzle, can you imagine that anybody would put it together exactly the same way as anybody else? I'm sure the answer is no. If you asked me how I would solve this budget problem, I would be happy to talk to you for the next 10 hours about what I would do. But I'm sure there's nobody in the world who agrees with me exactly. I know my wife doesn't agree with me on that. So we all have to understand that if the nation is going to come to a solution on this problem, because we all have different views and different opinions about what's important, we're all going to have to give something, because there can only be one solution. It can't be what each of us wants. Number two, the other thing that we know, and that is embodied in this statement that we propose to have business people sign. If the Congress addresses, and Congress and the President address this problem, and actually do what is necessary to reduce the budget deficit, I know that I will feel it. There's no way in this society with a budget problem this large that anybody can really escape all effects of the problem. If I were to tell you that I want all of you to go out there and sacrifice to solve the budget problem, and you all go out there and meanwhile I'm going to have lunch, I don't think you would consider that to be highly credible. It wouldn't be reasonable on my part, but beyond that, I know that I've got to participate in this solution. At the end of the day, we talk about shared sacrifice. If it's going to be fair, everybody's got to pitch in. All members of the United States, all members of the American community have got to pitch in and solve the problem. Point three, but speaking to you, our elected representatives, we want you to understand, we know that we're not going to get exactly what we want. We know that we're going to feel it. But that's okay. We want you to solve this problem. We understand that there must be compromise. We understand that we will feel the solution. We will not be angry with you if you make the necessary changes to split the difference among all of our parts of our community and get this nation back to a responsible budget policy. We will not be angry about that. If you want to know angry, then come back to me and tell me, hey, I have engineered gridlock. You will not have to suffer one thing to solve the budget problem. Nothing is going to happen. The nation's going to stay right on its course, and as a result of this, I'm going to win a political victory. If that's what our elected representatives are prepared to tell us, we have to explain to them that that political victory will be a defeat for the entire American community, for the U.S. economy, for the prosperity and the prospects for our children and our grandchildren. That is not a tolerable outcome. So, why come to the U.S. business community? Mike said that you will find a reference to Blazing Saddles in every talk I give. And here it comes. Those of you who remember Harvey Korman looking into the lens at the movie viewer and saying, where will I find such a man? Why am I asking you? Okay, so why am I asking you to become a part of an effort to try to communicate to our policymakers that we have to address this problem? We had a great conversation last night. Some members of the Business Council got together and we had dinner and we had a great conversation about one particular topic, and that was, here we have a group of business people, people who understand numbers, people who know what compound interest is, looking forward, seeing a very serious budget situation and realizing that it's urgent that we find a solution. But how do you go to the typical American citizen who may not have that kind of a background and explain to that person that cutting foreign aid will not solve a $1.5 trillion budget deficit. Cutting congressional salaries will not solve a $1.5 trillion budget deficit. Waste, fraud, and abuse is not the answer. We have to make real changes in the way the federal government operates. And as I think about it, there are perhaps two alternative ways to do that. Option A, we tell every American citizen, we're going to have you sit down with an economist for 2 hours, and he'll explain it to you. Now, which three of the American people do you think would take that deal? I mean, we always say you should trust the American people. I trust the American people to know a bad time when they see it coming. They're not going to sit down with me and talk for 2 hours. Okay, so what's option two? Option two, suppose that we get members of the U.S. business community to get together and state the facts and explain to the American public that we need to do some very difficult things. I'm going to take an example. Let's take Press Kabikoff. Press, when I was coming here from the airport, I saw your family name on so many walls here in Los Angeles that I became convinced that in your spare time, you're going up against Starbucks. And by the way, if you decide that you want to do that, it was my idea, so I want to get half. There are members of this business community who are known for being a part of the community, for helping the community grow, providing jobs, who have built up a reservoir of trust with your neighbors. Many of the typical American citizens who do not have the numerical skills, do not have the business background to understand what the federal balance sheet looks like, will be prepared to understand that a group of their business leaders, leaders in their communities, people who have stepped forward in difficult times and helped that community out, are going to be telling them the straight story. And that is one way to communicate not just to the typical American citizen, but also to our elected policymakers in Washington, that they have got to move forward and solve this problem, go into the room, find the way to resolve your differences, and turn this budget situation around. So in your packets, you'll see a statement of business principles. We're looking for business people from around the country to step forward and say that they believe that this is a problem that must be solved, say that they are willing to participate in the solution, say that they understand that nobody's going to get all his way out of this process. But by the time it's done, we will have a stronger, more secure, more prosperous nation going forward. So that's the message that I've carried here today. I'm going to step aside here now, and we're going to have a panel to speak to you further. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have as we continue this conversation. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the business councils. Happy to be here, and I hope that we can continue this conversation today.